December 1942. The North Atlantic is a graveyard. Convoys of Allied ships struggle through freezing storms, hunted day and night by German U-boats. Every few hours another freighter disappears beneath the waves, torpedoed, broken, gone. Tons of food, fuel and weapons sink into the icy dark. Britain, an island nation, begins to starve. In the war rooms beneath London, Winston Churchill receives grim reports. The Royal Navy cannot escort every convoy. Aircraft carriers are too few, too fragile, and far too slow to build. If the Atlantic is lost, the war is lost. Something has to change, something impossible. And then, out of nowhere, comes an idea that sounds insane. What if you could build a ship that could not sink? A ship so massive that torpedoes would barely scratch it. A ship made, not of steel, but of ice. Yes, ice. It sounds like science fiction or madness. But in the chaos of World War II, Britain had little choice but to listen to the dreamers, the eccentrics, the ones who saw the world differently. Because sometimes the craziest ideas are the only ones that just might work. The man behind this impossible vision was not a naval engineer or a general. He was a scientist, a journalist, and some said a lunatic. His name was Geoffrey Pyke, and he believed he could change the course of the war with nothing more than water, wood pulp, and imagination. The plan was simple in theory, absurd in reality. Freeze water mixed with sawdust into a new kind of material, stronger than ice, tougher than steel, and capable of surviving an explosion. A ship made of this miracle material could stretch over 2,000 feet long, a floating fortress capable of carrying aircraft across the Atlantic. Churchill's advisers laughed, but Pyke's allies didn't. One of them was Lord Mountbatten, the head of Britain's combined operations. Mountbatten was famous for his daring, and for his willingness to test the impossible. If Pyke's idea had even the smallest chance of working, Mountbatten wanted to try it. So, in secret, the British government launched an experimental project unlike anything seen before. Its code name, Project Habakkuk, taken from a biblical verse, "Behold ye among the heathen, and regard and wonder marvellously. For I will work a work in your days which ye will not believe, though it be told you." And indeed, few would believe what was about to happen. Deep in the frozen wilderness of Canada, a handful of engineers began building something the world had never seen, a ship made of ice, born from desperation and madness, and led by a man who refused to accept the word impossible. This is the story of Geoffrey Pyke, the scientist who tried to build a ship out of ice, and how, for a moment in time, the world's fate rested on a block of frozen water. To understand how a man could dream of building a ship from ice, you first have to understand the man himself, Geoffrey Nathaniel Pyke. He didn't look like a scientist or a soldier. He was a tall, thin man with messy hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the distracted stare of someone whose mind was always a few miles ahead of the world around him. Some called him brilliant, others called him unhinged, but everyone agreed on one thing: Geoffrey Pyke was different. Born in 1893 in London, Pyke was a child of curiosity. He questioned everything, from his teachers to the laws of physics. He never fit neatly into society's boxes. By the time he reached Cambridge, he was already known for eccentric experiments, once even building a makeshift lab in his dorm room to test bizarre ideas that no one else dared to try. He wasn't a soldier by trade, yet when the First World War broke out, he volunteered, not with a gun, but with a notebook. Pyke smuggled himself into Germany as a journalist to gather intelligence, only to be caught and imprisoned in a German internment camp. Most men would have broken. Pyke escaped. He literally dug his way out of captivity, crossing half of Europe to return home. That escape became legend, and it was just the beginning. By the 1930s, Pyke had transformed into a kind of rogue genius, a man who believed that science could, and must, be used to change the world. He founded schools, invented new teaching systems, and even designed mechanical devices long before computers were commonplace. But when World War II erupted, Pyke's restless mind turned toward war. He didn't carry a weapon. His weapon was his imagination. He joined the Combined Operations Headquarters, a new British unit tasked with finding unconventional solutions to impossible problems. Its leader, Lord Louis Mountbatten, believed Pyke's madness was exactly what the war effort needed. He gave him freedom and funding to think without limits. And Pyke didn't disappoint. His first idea? A plan to attack enemy-held Norway using snowmobiles launched from submarines. It sounded ridiculous, but the technology he created for it was revolutionary. He designed early prototypes of tracked snow vehicles, the ancestors of the machines that would one day traverse the Arctic and Antarctic. But Pyke's next idea would go even further. As German U-boats ravaged Allied convoys in the North Atlantic, Britain faced disaster. Aircraft could only protect convoys within a short range from shore. Beyond that lay a deadly zone known as the Black Gap. Dozens of ships disappeared there every week. Pyke believed he could close that gap, not with more steel, but with something the ocean already had in abundance: ice. He theorized that a ship made of frozen water, strengthened with sawdust, could resist torpedoes and stay afloat even when damaged. It wouldn't sink, because it was the ocean. When he presented the idea, military officials stared in disbelief. Some laughed out loud. A ship made of ice? Impossible, but Mountbatten didn't laugh. He'd seen Pyke turn wild ideas into real machines before, and in the desperate winter of 1942, even impossible ideas deserved a chance, so Pyke was given the green light. Quietly, secretly, a small group of scientists was assembled. Their mission: test Pyke's frozen miracle. In the mountains of Canada, where winter could preserve the experiment, they began to freeze water and pulp together, and the results astonished them. The new material was incredibly strong, able to stop bullets, absorb explosions, and stay frozen far longer than ordinary ice. It wasn't science fiction anymore. It was Pykrete, named after the mad inventor himself, and it was about to become the foundation of one of the strangest engineering projects in human history. By early 1943, Geoffrey Pyke's dream was beginning to take form, an idea so outlandish that it bordered on fantasy: to build a floating fortress out of ice. They called it Project Habakkuk, named after a verse from the Bible. "For I am doing something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told." And indeed, few would believe what was happening. In an era where every ton of steel was precious, Pyke's invention promised to build warships out of water, the most abundant material on Earth. If successful, these floating giants could patrol the Atlantic, serve as unsinkable aircraft carriers, and shield Allied convoys from German submarines. The concept sounded crazy, but so did radar, rockets, and nuclear bombs, all of which were already in motion. In wartime, madness was simply another form of innovation. The heart of Pyke's idea was a strange new substance: pykrete, a mixture of ice and wood pulp that behaved nothing like ordinary frozen water. When scientists shot bullets at it, they bounced off. When hit with an axe, it splintered instead of shattering. It melted slowly, held its shape, and could even be carved like metal. Pykrete was, in short, the world's first man-made ice armour. Word of the material spread quickly through Britain's high command, but one man wasn't convinced until he saw it for himself. That man was Winston Churchill. When Mountbatten told him about the project, Churchill's response was pure curiosity. He famously wrote, "Make the tests and report to me immediately." A few weeks later, at a secret demonstration in Canada, Mountbatten presented the miracle ice to a group of stunned military officers. To prove its strength, he ordered a pistol fired at 2 blocks, one made of regular ice, one made of pykrete. The first shattered instantly. The second caused the bullet to ricochet, nearly wounding one of the generals in the leg. Everyone in the room froze. The point was made. Churchill was now convinced. He wrote an enthusiastic note to his staff. "I want a ship made of this right away." Plans were drawn for a colossal vessel, 2,000 feet long, 300 feet wide, and weighing over 2 million tons. It would be larger than anything ever built by human hands. Engineers envisioned vast decks capable of launching bombers and fighters, ice walls thicker than battleship armour, and an internal refrigeration system to keep it from melting even under tropical sun. It sounded like something from a Jules Verne novel, but to Pyke it was only the beginning. He imagined fleets of ice ships patrolling every ocean, permanent floating bases for aircraft and soldiers, a new kind of warfare where nature itself became the weapon. But behind the bold plans came harsh realities. How could such a ship be powered? How would you steer something that weighed more than a mountain? And what would happen if it ever started to melt? Still, the project pushed forward. In early 1943, a secret team was sent to Lake Patricia in Alberta, Canada, a frozen wilderness chosen for one reason: it was cold enough to keep Pyke's dream alive. There, engineers began work on the first prototype of an ice ship. They didn't have blueprints, budgets, or even clear orders, only a mad idea and a deadline. What they built would shock the world. Deep in the frozen heart of Alberta, Canada, on the remote waters of Lake Patricia, a small team of engineers, soldiers and scientists arrived under strict secrecy. They had no official insignias, no clear orders, only a code name, Project Habakkuk, and a dream to build the world's first ship made of ice. The location was perfect, isolated, frigid, and far from enemy eyes. Temperatures dropped to 30 euros. The lake surface froze thick enough to support trucks, cranes, and equipment. If this mad plan was ever going to work, it would work here. At first, the team struggled just to begin. They lacked proper facilities, no heating, no workshops, and very few tools. Everything was improvised. They built small wooden shacks along the lake's edge, ran generators to power saws and mixers, and began experimenting with different mixtures of ice and wood pulp to perfect pykrete. Under the leadership of Geoffrey Pyke and Lord Mountbatten's advisors, the Canadian engineers, led by Geoffrey Pyke's assistant Max Perutz, a brilliant Austrian-born scientist, tested how this strange hybrid material behaved in real winter conditions. The results were astonishing. Ordinary ice cracked under weight. But blocks of pykrete, rough, fibrous and pale, could hold the weight of a truck without breaking. It didn't melt easily either. Even after hours in sunlight, it stayed solid. With new confidence, the men started construction on a miniature prototype, a floating platform 60 feet long and 30 feet wide. They built a wooden frame, packed it with layers of pykrete, and embedded a network of small copper pipes through its core. Cold water from the lake circulated through the pipes, acting as a built-in refrigeration system to keep the structure frozen solid. As days turned into weeks, the strange, ghostly ship began to take shape, rising slowly from the snow, gleaming under the northern sun like a frozen whale emerging from the depths. Locals in nearby Jasper whispered rumours of a secret ice submarine. Few believed it. The project was too bizarre to be real, but inside that frozen lab the scientists believed they were building the future. The prototype performed better than anyone expected. It floated, it carried weight, it resisted melting even under the weak spring sun. For a moment Pyke's dream seemed unstoppable. He wrote in his notes, "This is not just a ship, it is a revolution in thinking. We are bending the laws of nature." But even as the frozen structure stood solid, cracks were beginning to form, not just in the ice but in the project itself. The ship worked, but it was slow to build, massively expensive, and required constant refrigeration just to stay alive. Engineers warned that to build a full-sized version would require thousands of tons of wood pulp, an enormous refrigeration system, and months of work in dangerous cold conditions. And there was one more problem. The war was changing. By the time Habakkuk could be finished, its purpose might already be gone. Still, Mountbatten and Pyke pressed forward. The fate of the project would soon rest in the hands of one man, a Canadian engineer who would ultimately decide whether this miracle of ice would live or die. By the summer of 1943, the secret base on Lake Patricia had become something out of science fiction. In the middle of the frozen wilderness stood a bizarre creation, a small, floating fortress made of ice and wood pulp. For months, engineers had worked through freezing nights, hauling water, chopping wood, and pouring mixture into moulds. The strange structure, half ship, half glacier, now sat proudly in the water, a proof that Geoffrey Pyke's mad idea could actually float. When the final test began, the engineers felt a strange mix of pride and disbelief. They walked across the icy deck, listening to it groan underfoot, hearing the faint hum of refrigeration pipes deep within. It was working. But almost immediately, new problems began to appear. The refrigeration system, designed to keep the pykrete frozen, kept breaking down. The Canadian engineers struggled to keep the pipes from freezing solid or leaking water. Each time the system stopped, the surface began to melt, dripping water into the lake like slow tears. Even worse, the ice didn't behave as predicted. It bent, warped, and expanded with temperature changes. The ship's walls cracked, and repairs were endless. Every few days they had to patch it with new layers of frozen pulp. Still, the team refused to give up. For weeks they fought to keep the ice alive, rebuilding, freezing, testing again and again. Finally, in the summer of 1943, Lord Mountbatten flew to Canada to see it for himself. When he arrived, he was escorted out to the floating prototype. The air shimmered with heat, a bad omen for a ship made of ice. He walked around it, touched the picrete walls, and smiled with genuine amazement. The ship was still there, solid, cold, and afloat. But when the engineers showed him the costs and challenges of scaling it up, his smile faded. To build a full-sized Habakkuk, the floating aircraft carrier Pyke had imagined, they would need 300,000 tons of wood pulp, 25,000 tons of insulation, 2,000 workers, and millions of pounds of steel for the cooling system. It would take more than a year to finish, and the war might already be decided by then. In the same months, Allied scientists were perfecting long-range aircraft that could patrol the Atlantic without needing a floating base. The original reason for Habakkuk was disappearing, and Geoffrey Pyke, the man behind it all, was growing more and more unstable. Exhausted, depressed, and frustrated by bureaucracy, he began to fade from the project entirely. By late 1943, the British government quietly pulled the plug. Funding stopped. The team was ordered to dismantle the prototype. No public announcement was ever made. The dream of the ice ship simply melted away. When the last engineers left Lake Patricia, they left the frozen hull where it stood. Over the following years, the picrete ship slowly sank beneath the surface, vanishing into the cold, dark waters where it had been born. For decades, no one spoke of it again. It became a whisper, a legend buried in ice. For years after the project was shut down, Project Habakkuk disappeared into the fog of forgotten wartime experiments. Few people outside a handful of Allied scientists even knew it had existed. The reports were stamped top secret, the files locked away in government archives, and the frozen prototype on Lake Patricia was left to vanish quietly beneath the surface. Geoffrey Pyke, the visionary who had dared to imagine ships made of ice, was left heartbroken. He had spent years trying to convince leaders that his inventions could change the world. But in the end, bureaucracy, cost, and time had won. The war machine moved on, leaving dreamers like Pyke behind. He returned to London a broken man, his wild intelligence dimmed by disappointment. He wrote letters, papers, and proposals, but none of them found support. In 1948, Geoffrey Pyke took his own life. He died believing his greatest idea had melted away forever. But history, as it often does, had a way of preserving the truth, hidden beneath layers of time and ice. Decades later, in the 1970s, a team of Canadian divers exploring Lake Patricia stumbled upon something strange on the lake bed. A shape too regular to be natural, massive beams of wood, metal pipes frozen into place, and traces of fibrous material unlike anything they'd ever seen. They had found it, the remains of the Habakkuk prototype still lying there, perfectly preserved by the cold depths. When historians pieced together the discovery, they realized just how close Pyke's vision had come to reality. The ship had worked. It had floated. And for a brief, shining moment, it had convinced the most powerful men in the world that anything was possible. Today, the site of Lake Patricia is still quiet, surrounded by forest and mountains, its surface calm and still. Beneath it rests a forgotten relic of human imagination, a reminder that even the most impossible dreams can leave a trace. Pyke's idea, though never realized, inspired generations of engineers and scientists to think differently, to see that sometimes the line between genius and madness is nothing more than a thin layer of ice. And perhaps that is Geoffrey Pyke's true legacy, not the ship itself, but the courage to believe that no idea is too strange to try. The world never saw Geoffrey Pyke's ship of ice sail across the ocean. No headlines, no parades, no glory, just silence and the slow melting of a dream that was too strange, too soon, and too far ahead of its time. Yet in that frozen Canadian lake, a handful of men dared to challenge the impossible. They took something as fragile as ice and tried to turn it into armor. In a war defined by destruction, their creation was something different, an act of pure imagination. Pyke may have failed, but his failure carried meaning, because behind every great victory there are thousands of ideas that didn't survive, but made the future possible. And beneath the surface of Lake Patricia, that ghost of a ship still lies in the cold dark, a frozen monument to human curiosity, to madness and genius intertwined, and to the belief that even in war the mind can dream beyond the battlefield. So the next time you look at a frozen lake, remember that once someone looked at ice and saw a ship and dared to build it.